Cooperative Extension. Every county in Arizona has a cooperative extension. You may be familiar with some of our other programs such as 4-H, food safety, nutrition education, STEM and commercial horticulture, and small acreage support. Master gardeners provide science-based horticulture information, and tonight's presentation is maximizing the success of your home garden. Now, as many of you might have seen, this presentation will be recorded for your future viewing pleasure. And tonight we are so excited to have our speaker with us. Her name is Leslie Allward. And Leslie, I'm going to ask you to share your screen. Leslie is a Yavapai County Master Gardener Emeritus. She's with the class of 2005. She's a past gardener and landscape contractor in both California and Arizona. I won't say the years, but let's say spanning a decade or two. And a past landscaping and gardening consultant as Arizona Garden Gals. Now, Leslie aspires to make gardening a fun, rewarding, and successful enterprise by sharing her knowledge and experience. She gives garden-related talks to Quad Cities, Sedona Garden Clubs, and at the Prescott and Prescott Valley Public Libraries, and at Yavapai College through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which we all call OLLI. Her favorite subjects are landscape design using native plants in your home landscape, creating native habitats, and hands-on tips to maximize the success of your gardening efforts. Leslie can frequently be found in her large butterfly garden rich in nectar plants and milkweed, or tending vegetables in raised beds located in low water garden native and regionally adapted plants nestled in the oak pinyon landscape. Leslie, do you have your presentation ready?
I do.
Go ahead and share it, and welcome Leslie.
Is it not shared?
No, it's not showing up on the screen.
Okay, well, it's on mine. Let me,
If you click share screen and pick the screen.
That's what I did. And let's try it again. Let's go back.
And folks, we did practice this.
Actually, we did, and I did exactly what we did in the practice, and it didn't give me the opportunity to get to my desktop. So, let's see. Well,
I'm looking to see.
I'm going to open it again. Okay, here I am. And let's get rid of that. And share screen.
We still have people joining us.
There it is. There it is. Okay. How about that? Is that better?
Take it away, Leslie.
Well, I have to get to the slideshow. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to get rid of us all over here, get out of the way. And hello, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of the ways to maximize your success in your home garden. I am a proud graduate of the class of 2005 and have spent a lot of years, both here and in California, as a landscaper. Starting out in maintaining gardens and then becoming a landscape contractor and designing and building gardens, both in the Bay Area of California and here in Prescott. So I really had the good fortune to start my career in gardening in the Bay Area, because there you can grow a wider variety of plants, from subtropicals to subalpines. And the soil, number one, there is soil. Number two, it's close to neutral. And so it's very, very easy to garden. So my second thing that I was excited about, I had the good fortune to learn of the Master Gardener class when I moved here. In 2003, I learned of it and took the class in 2005. And it helped me make sense of alkaline soil and alkaline water and how that impacts gardening here in sort of every way. And so over my years as a landscaper and home gardener, I've synthesized some of these sound gardening practices to share with you today, as much based on science as possible. So let's dive in. So how can you maximize your success in your gardening efforts? Number one, I've always found that through thoughtful observation, inquiry, and discovery with an understanding of science, you can actually succeed here. We're going to divide this into 3 sections: plant selection, planting techniques, and also post-planting techniques. At the end of each section, you will have an opportunity to ask questions instead of waiting until the very end. When we think of plant selection, right plant, right place is really the crucial determiner. And what does that mean? So number one, you want to make certain to buy healthy plants from reputable sources. You want to always avoid stressed plants or root-bound trees and shrubs. And you always want to know a plant's USDA hardiness zone to ensure the survivability. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So you want to personally select your plants based upon your garden site. You should know your local microclimate. Many places in Prescott Valley, Dewey, and Chino have small areas that are either banana belts or especially cold comparatively. You should know if you're in one of them. You always want to think of the orientation of your garden. Is your garden west facing, south facing? Is it on the east side of your home and gets afternoon respite from the hot sun? What's the aspect? In other words, what is the slope? So for instance, I have a 2,700 square foot what used to be a vegetable garden, and it's south facing. In other words, slope, so that it gets perpendicular sun during the summer, which is the hottest potential sun. Where do the prevailing winds come from? And how might you block them and how might you choose plants which aren't particularly susceptible to wind damage? What elements shade your garden? Do you want them there? Do you want to add them later? If you're planting a full shade plant, planning on a tree that is currently 3 foot high to be its shade, can you really plant that lower level, that understory plant yet? And of course, the most important thing is knowing your soil type. Is it sandy? Is it loamy? If it is, you're so lucky. Is it clay? Is it rocky? Do you have any soil at all? So these are all things you have to observe on your own property. Now, cold hardiness or hardiness and to cold is the limiting factor here in our mile-high area or almost mile-high area. You can go online, and this presentation is going to be online, or if it's not already. So you just go to this website, click it, and it's an interactive map. You can get quite small, but in general, our Prescott area is in the 7A, 7B. Sometimes if it's up toward the mountains, towards 6B, in other words, with a -5 to 0 as being the low, whereas Chino Valley, Prescott Valley, Dewey are more in the 8A and 8B with lows of 10 or 15. If in doubt about your specific area, always err on going one lower. So for instance, when I look at plants, because I'm in a little low, cold area, I look for plants that can survive -5 rather than the typical 0 that Prescott would be. So consider that. And then you want to make certain that you're thinking about what is the purpose of your garden. If your purpose is to grow vegetables, then you are going to have to add organic matter to your soil to improve the neutrality. You're going to have to use fertilizers. You're going to have to think of your individual plants, such as tomatoes. Tomatoes were originally tropical. they want to live between 55 degrees and 85 degrees. Below that or above that, they readily drop their blossoms, and therefore you have just foliage and no fruit. So typically here, because I get hot sun, I have them shaded anytime the temperature is over 85. I simply created a framework. I can pull back the shade cloth when it's not that hot and put it over. Additionally, I would use walls of water, which are shown in the middle, when they are young, to extend my season earlier so that I can plant my own starts. They both warm the soil as well as the plant. If none of you have used these, or if you've not used these walls of water, they are simply freestanding things. The channels are filled with water. They warm during the day, radiate heat at night. And I think even more importantly is they stop the desiccation of our little starts by the winds that we have in the late spring. So any vegetable or raspberries or blackberries, I will use the walls of water to get things started early. And if I have forbs, flowering plants, I'll use these additionally, not because they necessarily will die, but the foliage may get severely freeze damage by lower temperatures and by having a small root structure that can't support all the top growth. All righty, so that would be one purpose. If your purpose is to do flowers, then remember, if you're using non-native flowers, then you might have to amend the soil with nitrogen. If they're annuals, remember, give them what they want, when they want it. They only survive a year. There's not a great expense. Consider your labor as a labor of love. If you want the flowers, deadhead them frequently. If you want seeds for birds, then you might consider deadheading some, leaving some of the seeds to go to the seed heads intact, and finches and other small birds absolutely love these. If you desire to have butterflies, I have a 2,700 square foot butterfly garden. You want to have tons of flowering shrubs and forbs. Forbs, remember, are what people used to call perennials. Well, mostly. They are flowering, non-woody, non-grass plants. They may be annual or perennial. They may live for years. If you're going to have butterflies, you want to make sure to have blooms that start in the spring and go all the way through as late in the fall as possible to catch the migrating monarchs or other butterflies which do migrate. And you want to make sure to feed the young. So most people know that monarchs like horsetail or any kind of milkweed. I have tons of horsetail running through my garden, and every butterfly nectars on it. But the queens and monarchs, that is their host plant for their youngsters, for caterpillars. Here on the right is actually a black swallowtail. I had planted some fennel because I love to use the bulb for salads and such, for culinary reasons. I went out and discovered about 30 of these little critters with very little foliage left on my plant. But fennel is an awesome host plant for the black swallowtail. If birds are your passion, then make sure to create a canopy of safety, so where they can have protection as well as where they can nest. Make sure not to be too tidy about your garden because they want to use the leaves and small twigs to create nests. Make sure you let some of your plants go to seed to feed, especially the finches. Use tubular flowers, as you know, penstemons and yuccas, and even the desert willow for hummingbirds. And I've recently, I revamped my garden, and in removing some of my old hedges that my parents had actually planted, I have a garden now full of native mallow and globe mallow, and the hummers are going after it like crazy because they've kind of exhausted the yuccas and penstemons. And if you want birds, the first and most important thing probably is water at different levels. If you'll see on the left side, there's a higher and a lower bird bath. And then on the right is for birds as well as perching areas for insects so they don't drown. The next thing you really want to think of in terms of your purpose is, where do you get your information about the plants you purchase? Obviously, we're going to promote Master Gardener help desks. And if you get online information using the anything with .edu, indicates it's an institution of higher education, a college or a university, clearly a solid source. We have our Master Gardener Association, Yavapai County Native and Naturalized Plants website. A couple others I'll just mention as we go in passing. And then of course, local plant retail stores, nurseries, or big box stores are sources of plants. And we'll talk further about that. So if you've not ever visited our Yavapai County Native and Naturalized Plants website, it's full of an amazing amount of information, divided by type of plant. And then once you click on the type, it will be divided by, for instance, color of bloom. So from wild flowers to trees, you have a great deal of information there. Mountain States Wholesale Nursery, I'm not recommending this as a source of buying plants because you cannot. It is just that, it's a wholesale nursery. It doesn't allow the public to purchase there. And if you've ever been to, for instance, a plant sale, Monsoon Madness, or the Highland Center, we always utilize their information pages because they're really drilled down on the things that are important about each plant. And you as the public have access to this on their website, MSWN. They do specialize in water efficient plants. They are located in Glendale, Arizona, so heat is never a concern. Again, when looking at this, they may well have plants that aren't hardy here, but you are able to put in your hardiness zone and see only those plants that are hardy to your zone. So it's a great source of information. High Country Gardens, this I am recommending as a source of information. Your decision whether to purchase or not is your decision, but they have wonderful information, and I love looking at these pages and seeing right up top, what is the hardiness zone? Easy to grow. Here, they're good for containers, cut flowers, rock garden, attract butterflies, attract hummers, rabbit resistance. So in a nutshell, they tell you a great deal of information. And then as you scan down, there's even more information. So I think this is a wonderful source. And what we found is the local nurseries are becoming more interested in native plants, and they will frequently source them. In other words, order them from different places, and things that used to only be available online through High Country Gardens are showing up in commercial nurseries. So where do you get your plants? All of these are perfectly fine sources with some caveats for each. Online, you don't have an opportunity to actually see the product until it arrives. And while they've gotten really good at packaging plants, they typically are smaller and sometimes get damaged in transit. But nevertheless, you can get a great deal of variety. The big box stores might carry perfectly good stock. My experience is that their watering schedule is rather unsteady. It's not regular. And so in my experience, I've seen frequent drying and wetting and drying and wetting. And so there's this constant stress to the plants, which can affect their future health. Local nurseries are carrying more and more varieties of plants, and they may or may not have really informed salespeople. Some are not as informed as you would like, especially if you're a master gardener. And then the specialty nurseries may have more knowledge in regards to their specialty. I think of the native garden principally because that is a place where if I'm looking for native plants and don't want to go online, they will source them if they can find wholesalers that will provide them. So that's a value. So again, given, you decide where you buy, and there's no wrong answer, just be aware of their concerns. To go back to the big box stores, I always just find out when they get their orders. And I found for a while that one particular store got their orders early on Thursday, so I'd go Thursday afternoon, and then the plants were in wonderful condition. The other thing you want to think about is what type of plants are you getting? Are you getting non-native plants? Those are not native to our area or even to the Southwest. Are they native and naturalizing? In other words, they may be annuals, which freely seed, and so an annual sort of becomes a perennial in essence because it seeds, it reseeds itself and lives again. There are annual natives, there are annual non-natives. With annuals, you can give them a little bit more care and they're a little bit less concerned about soil because they live and die in a single season, or rather a single year. And then perennials simply means that they live more than 1 year. There are short-lived perennials and very long-lived perennials. So let's talk a little bit about native plants. And they are adapted to our local climate. We'll talk a bit about that. They're additionally adapted to our native soils. Now there's a caveat here. If you've just had a home built and in the process of building the foundation, they remove soil from down deep and spread it upon the surface of your lot, that soil has little, if any, organic content or oxygen or anything. And so you have to sort of take that with a grain of salt, so to speak. They support biological diversity and provide habitat, which is what I enjoy. And then, of course, they're low maintenance and beautiful, but we'll talk more about the scientific aspects. This is just a schematic of crested climate data, and indeed, if you don't look specifically at the values, it still represents our Quad City experience. The important thing about our plants is they're used to 30-degree swings from day to night, whether it's in the wintertime, spring, summer, fall. We typically get 30-35-degree temperature swings, which our native plants are accustomed to. Additionally, we get precipitation principally in the winter and summer, not in the spring when most non-native plants are begging for water, nor in the fall. So our plants here that are native are accustomed to this. They're adapted to our native soils additionally. So that means they require no amendments to correct for the alkalinity of our soils or the alkalinity of our water incidentally. And they do not require fertilizers. Remember seeing this chart or a facsimile thereof during your Master Gardener class? In the center is the optimum pH zone for soil. This is what my original 10 years of landscape experience was surrounded by. I could plant almost anything anywhere. So the bright green is highly available for all the macronutrients and micronutrients that are required. The light green is marginally available. The yellow is slightly available. And as you look where our soils frequently are in the 7.5 to even 8.5 range, more and more things go to marginally available. And one of the most critical things is the marginal availability of potassium while there's a high availability of calcium. And if you've read, in fact, I'll go on to this, if you've read any of Schlau's Backyard Gardener articles, he goes into this in depth. Again, I gave the specific URL so you can look it up later. And these are his words, that maximum phosphorus availability occurs between 6 and 7. And in Yavapai County, our soils tend to be alkaline, have a pH of 7 to 7.8. I tested mine early in my gardening career here, and mine was 8.25, so even further. And so here he mentions that there's a high calcium concentration that binds whatever phosphorus you add if you top dress it on the surface of the soil, and it creates this phosphorus fixation as calcium phosphate is created. Plants can't use it. So one of the things I always suggest, if not using if you're using non-native plants, including vegetables, flowers, shrubs, trees, is first, if there seems to be a problem, correct for alkalinity. In other words, try and move it toward a more neutral place. You can do that with soil sulfur if you have a garden that is not in close proximity to your home or someone else's. Otherwise, you will have people commenting upon the sulfur smell, the rotten egg smell. But it is useful. Soil acidifier also comes in a liquid form. Typically, it has iron, because that is one of the things that iron is also marginally available, and that's responsible for sort of the anemia that plants might display, especially plants that like a little bit more acidic soil. You can also use compost of any sort, whether you create it yourself or buy it from a store, and that helps move the bar slightly toward a more neutral pH. So as the thing about native plants, and a reason to utilize native plants, is that they do have this symbiotic relationship with the microbes in the soil. So if you think of the plant leaves as sort of solar panels, they're gathering energy, taking it down through the roots and supporting the growth of roots, stem, as well as leaves. And in the soil are a variety of mycorrhizae, fungi, bacteria that do not have the capacity to photosynthesize because they're in the ground and they don't have the chlorophyll necessary. So the plant provides carbohydrates or energy down through the root system to these microbes. And they in turn make the macronutrients of potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus available to the plants in a form that they can utilize. And so they get to live and they give back to the plants. So in this instance, if you're using native plants, you want to avoid fertilizer because that upsets the balance of this symbiotic relationship and is detrimental to the actual microbes. So you save money by not having to buy fertilizers or amendments. Another thing that we'll talk about in terms of the right plant is what size are you choosing to utilize? Are you starting from seed, such as creating maybe a wildflower garden, or in many instances lettuces and things of this nature, or other small vegetables? Are you using 6-packs? 6-packs have a lot of top growth in general for their root volume and pretty much require regular watering. Let me go back momentarily to the seeds. Obviously, you need to prepare a seed bed well. You can't just typically throw them on our soil surface. You need to prepare it so that the seeds have the opportunity to grow roots into a softened substrate. and typically you'll protect it from birds and other animals additionally. You have to keep it moist until the true leaves form. And then if you're using drought tolerant types, within a year or so of regular watering, you can start really significantly cutting back the water. With 6-packs, pretty much have to water twice a day if you're starting them late in the spring or summer, sometimes even more. Mulching is helpful in this regard to retain moisture. As you move up to the 4-inch pot, it's got a better amount of roots, and so it can better support the top growth that it's going to experience in the spring and summer. A 1-gallon pot is considered kind of an ideal size for starting most plants that are perennial in nature. In other words, live more than a single year. There is transplant shock whenever you do take a plant from its cushy little life in a nursery. Even native plants, they haven't been treated as though they're living in a native environment. They have been given regular water. They've been given very good soil that drains well and yet provides the nutrients they need. So they need to make this transition from a cushy life to our soil and our hot sun, our hot high elevation sun, and our spring and early summer winds. So a 1-gallon pot has minimum or the minimum amount of sort of transplant shock and enough roots to help support that top growth. Typically, if people want to use structural elements in their garden, trees and shrubs, they'll go higher to a 5-gallon pot, and then maybe as large as a 15-gallon or beyond 24-inch box even for mature trees. Each time you move up, there is some greater amount of transplant shock. However, if you look at a 5-gallon pot planted at the same time as a 1-gallon pot, in 3 to 4 years, you will know the difference. So remember that part of this is patience, and also just because the 1-gallon does get started a little bit earlier and more easily. So these are the concepts about selecting the right plant in the right place and things that you need to know about your garden site. Do you have any questions?
So far, nobody's put anything in the chat box. So everyone knows I did put both of those URLs out there that Leslie had referred to. So Leslie?
Okay, wonderful. Let's get on to planting techniques. And first we'll mention when you might want to plant. Then we'll remind everybody about the U of A planting guidelines, and then hydration techniques that I've found to work based on an understanding of how water moves through soil. So, from your point of view, what is a typical season that most people would plant fruit and fruit trees and bare root, say, roses? Do people have an understanding of that? You want to share that with me, Tricia? Nothing? Okay.
And Douglas asked, is aged manure mulch good for natives and good for milkweed?
Well, it depends. So typically you wouldn't want to use, the thing about manure is it does contain a lot of salts. A more balanced compost, top dressed, is going to, in general, improve the soil, but you want to make sure it's well composted. So I would not, the only thing I do with native plants, and we'll talk about this a little bit down the road in terms of amendment, is if there's real problems with drainage of your soil, then it's wise to amend. So we will talk about soil amendment in just a tad, okay?
Okay.
So let's start, does that work for you?
We had 2 more questions pop up. And if you want to say you'll be answering these or to wait, great.
Yeah.
Shirley wants to know, do you have any recommendations on what varieties of tomatoes work best here in this area?
No, but there's, there are many people in the slow food movement, terroir seeds, people, and if you just Google, what would you Google? Tomatoes that would do well in the Prescott, Arizona area, you will find many hybrids.
Plus, we have our Master Gardener Tomato Survey put out at the end of every summer, recorded on our website.
And well, in general, you don't want to use the really large. They want to be, ripen in 70 to 80 days max, just because of the duration of our growing season is not as long. So some of the larger ones won't do as well. One of the things you want to be careful about is if and when we do get monsoon rains, the uneven watering does create cracks, and I simply cut them out. I've grown a number of different varieties. I planted Cherokee Purple this year, and it's done magnificently. I also planted a cherry tomato called Indigo Plum, I think, that has done amazingly. Both taste amazing. Remember, if you're looking at any variety of vegetable and it doesn't specifically mention taste, then what they've done is hybridize it for hardiness and ability to transport as opposed to for taste. So make sure that the tag says that the taste is superb when you start looking at your own when your own starts or whatever you purchase.
Okay, Leslie, go ahead and move on. And the next question, it looks like you're floating into anyway.
Okay, so springtime is when typically there's the highest availability of plants. The soil is just starting to warm, so that will retard their growth early on, which is part of the reason, again, I'll go back to using the walls of water, because the walls of water serve to warm the area within the ring. And typically with spring things, smaller root ball, much top growth that is going to soon, if it hasn't already, begun to blossom. So there's a fair amount of stress on the plant. Typically with forbs, annuals, and small, younger shrubs, this is when things are available. In the summer, obviously we have our heat, and the plant is doing the same things as it was doing in the spring, just more of it. Hopefully, we've got a little bit of root growth to support more of that top growth, but it's got leafing and it's got flowering or fruiting and hot weather. So this is a time when you really need to emphasize a regular water schedule. And there's no easy way to tell you how much to water. We'll talk about this a little bit down the road. But typically summer planting is hard on the plant. It's very stressful, but there's high availability of plants, and it's when people want to be outdoors, especially early in the summer and later in the summer. Fall, which really starts middle of September or earlier, really, is for many things, especially deciduous trees and shrubs, and spring and summer blooming forbs, grasses, a wonderful time to plant. The soil is still warm. The plant knows, because the days are shortening, it's cooling some, that they're supposed to start hunkering in and emphasize either seed growth or root growth and not top growth. So it's actually quite a good time to plant. One caveat to this is that conifers, evergreen conifers, prefer a little longer time to get root establishment, and because of the size of the needles, they can tolerate the summer sun more. So it's better to start conifers earlier you know, maybe July, August, as opposed to waiting till later in the fall. But when you're dealing with deciduous trees, they drop their leaves, their water needs are less, and so there's an emphasis on root growth. And by spring of next year, it feels like they've been in the ground a full season, when indeed it's only a half year. Winter is a time when you will do your bare root trees. And when we say winter, it's more like late January, February, depending upon the moisture in the soil. You do not want to work muddy soil. So you have to be cautious of that. And sometimes the availability of the stock is impacted. Much of it comes from Oregon because they have lots of rain. And if it's too muddy for them to lift the plants and put them in their either B&B or ball and burlap, or bring them down and plant them, it may be put off. But roses, bare root trees are perfect in winter. Make certain to hydrate the roots really well before planting and remove any damaged roots. Whoop, I forgot that I'd had all these things in here. So if you see the website itself, or the presentation itself, it will have the explanations. And I had forgotten that because I don't do it often. This is one point, is that plant roots grow whenever the temperature is 40 degrees or above. So if you start in September and very latest early October, you get a nice amount of root growth for your trees. Okay, so how many of you remember the U of A planting guidelines? So I want to emphasize that this is for trees and shrubs, in other words, woody plants. And here it shows you want a sloped hole. You want to loosen 3 to 5 times of the root ball, only as deep as the native soil. You create a berm around the edge of the root ball to focus all water into that place. As the trees grow, you move that berm outward to accommodate the root growth that has occurred, okay? It also mentions 3-inch minimum of organic mulch. That would be chipped wood or bark, and it should not touch the trunk. Too many people do this. You don't want to hold moisture against the trunk. The bark of the trunk is different than the bark of the roots. The roots obviously can tolerate water. The trunk cannot. Okay? Now, what does this 3 to 5 times as wide mean? Okay, so this is for a 1 gallon plant. This is a hammer that's a foot long. So at least a foot long for 1 gallon plants, a foot wide, excuse me. More like 2.5 foot wide for a 5 gallon, and minimum of 4.5 feet wide for a 15 gallon plant. Now, there's no need to remove that soil from the hole. You loosen it so that the roots that have had a cushy life in their nice little good soil and in a nursery will venture into this native soil. If you need to address drainage, here it gives the example of hardpan. And this is where they talk about that calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate creates caliche. You actually have to use a pick or a pry bar or something to get these little channels through it so that it can drain. If you dig a hole in advance of planting and put water in it and it does not drain within 24 hours at the very, very, very maximum, then you need to either go upward with your soil, create a mound that is held in by, for instance, some sort of edging, rocks will work, or go to a different place or create these chimneys. So these are minimum sizes, minimum sizes. And remember, this was determined by scientific planting of different trees, and trees, same area, using different widths of loosening, depths, and all this. And then they lifted them with the backhoes to look at their root systems to determine that. And always, always, always handle the plant by the root ball, not by the trunk or stem. Soil is heavy and roots are tender, and they will just pull off their connection. So when once you're ready to do you've done your hole, you've dug it, you've removed only enough material from the center for the plant to sit at the same level as the soil in the pot. A good thing to do if the soil is really dry is go ahead and, prior to putting the plant in there, fill the hole with water, let it drain completely. Again, if it's not draining quickly, what I typically do is loosen wider to allow the water that you do put into the root ball to move by capillary action outward additionally, so it's not just making the soil in the root ball boggy. So once you've dug your hole, you've hydrated it, not necessarily all the material around it, but the area that you're going to plant in, take your plants in their pots, submerge them entirely in a container of water. You will literally have to hold them down because they will bob to the surface because the amount of oxygen in the root ball. Seriously, try it. You will have to hold them underwater for quite a while, and it might take 30 seconds, it might take a minute for the bubbles to stop emerging. Then you remove it from the water, you let them drain entirely. And now you know that the root ball is hydrated. The reason we do this, I'll just leave it here for this moment, is that water does not like to move between different types of materials until the one hydrated part is saturated. Now, do you think the soil in a gardening container from a nursery is different than our soil? That's been my experience. So if you want it, and loosened soil does accept water because you've created all sorts of air gaps for the water to flow through. So it's really important to have the root ball wet. Very difficult to moisten a dry root ball once it's in the ground. Very difficult. Okay. The second thing you want to do is maximize the contact between the soil of the plant and the native soil. Again, this goes back to how water likes to move through soil. We want to create as many contact spots as available so it increases the soil surface, so that a couple things happen. The roots, as they're going toward the native soil, into the native soil, they sort of get lodged into these small little nooks and crannies, and they aren't able to decide, I don't like this stuff that I'm going into, and I'm just going to start circling. Because that's sometimes what happens with people's trees, especially, but it can happen to shrubs, when circling roots have not been cut or removed, they've been planted, and over the years, 5-8 years later, the roots, because they expand in diameter, just like the tree trunk does, they begin girdling one another, and the tree or shrub simply starts dying. And there's nothing you can particularly do about it at this stage. So it's important to encourage the roots to move outward, which is why you do loosen, as well as roughen up the exterior, so that when it gets through that material, it will continue into the native soil. Gently loosen the root ball, again, to create a little bit of roughness there. If there are circling roots, which are very obvious, if you can gently pull them down, and what I do is I use my shears, but I turn them upside down so it's just the non-sharp tip that I'm using as a tool to pull pull them down and gently separate them at the bottom of the root ball. Or indeed, if it's a 1 gallon plant or a 15-gallon tree that has dramatic circling roots, you actually will cut through them in quarter quadrants. So go down one side, at least a ½ inch in for 1 gallon and 5 gallon plants, and then pivot it quarter, do it again, and do it again. My suggestion for trees is simply not to buy a tree that has circling roots, and you can see it on the surface of the soil. If there's the roots directly around the crown, you can also see it typically because roots are growing out the bottom holes. If they are circling, what some people have done, and I can't remember the name of the woman, but she's up in the University of Washington, she suggests bare rooting every tree that you purchase. In other words, purchase it in a pot, take it out of the pot, wash off all the soil, make sure you separate all the roots, remove dead ones, and make sure there's nothing circling before you replant. This does require staking because there's no longer the weight of the root ball to support it. Jeff had some concerns about that because, of course, in Washington it's a wet environment. Here you have to water copiously in order to get those roots regrowing. So it's a technique to utilize. Think of it if you would like. When planting, not get the backfill moist before using it to fill around the plant. If you need to improve the drainage or water holding capacity for non-natives or riparian native trees that grow in streams and tolerate wet feet, so to speak, or if you need to add organic content for instance, for fruit production, you may add either composted mulch if you don't need a lot of nitrogen content. It's mostly carbon. You can use compost if you want to add to the organic content, or you can use manure if you want to add to the organic content. Always use less than 25%. If you don't want to add any organics at all, for instance, I have heavier soil. I love penstemons because I love bringing both bees as well as hummers to my garden, but I have a problem with things dying over the winter because of winter snows and winter precipitation. I can't put well, I could, I guess, umbrella over them, but that doesn't really work. So what I've taken to doing, and I know it's available at Prescott Dirt, and I'm only mentioning that because I know it's available there. It may well be available elsewhere, but to get cinders. Cinders are organic, volcanic rocks that are broken up, and they're used for the roads after snows and when there's ice. So you can get it in bulk there. And I add, if I'm doing a 5-gallon plant, I'll add a full 5 gallons to the soil. I'll mix it up really well, and it simply lightens it up without adding any organic material for the plants that like real lean growth. Okay, so don't pre-wet your backfill before planting because all those air gaps that are in soil naturally allow water and thus air to get down to the roots. I recently heard of somebody who was transplanting a tree, so they had ripped it up at this time of year, which is too bad, it's hot, and they had to move it. They didn't rip it up, they removed it. When they replanted it, they actually used a slurry of mud around the root ball. And I didn't comment because by this time it was too late, but it's like, ooh, because mud does not have any air channels to allow water to move through, and thus there was not going to be too much oxygen around that root ball for some period of time. So so use your backfill that's dry. It can be slightly moistened. I usually, if I'm going to plant, I dig a hole, I moisten the hole itself, slightly moisten the exterior, break up the large clots, and then I come back later and plant when the soil is very workable. Remember to avoid planting too deep. About the only thing that likes to be planted deep are tomatoes and tomatillos, because they'll actually send out new roots from the nodes that you take off the lower leaves, and plant them deep, and from those nodes, roots will grow, and it helps for the stability of the plant because of the height and width of them. But beyond that, you want to plant equal to the depth of the plant in the container, not to the depth of the container, but to the soil in the container. And be cautious too, because frequently in nurseries, people plant them when they're planted or transplanted, moved up in size. They do it pretty quickly. You know, the workers have lots to do, and sometimes trees especially will be too deep into the soil. You should begin to see the flare out at the bottom of the trunk to where the roots begin. If you don't see that flare, actually move away the soil from the trunk at that point. If they have planted deeply, it's especially important to notice circling roots right at the top near the crown, because they will have developed. So be cautious there. When you compact the soil around a plant, around a new root ball, do it gently. You know, fingers, the end of the shovel, yes, feet, no. If you're planting a 15-gallon tree or larger, or even sometimes with a 5, put in a few inches of soil, perhaps halfway up to the root ball. Go ahead and water that. Allow the water to gently compact it, and then keep adding soil until that point where, it is equal to the original root ball. So this goes back to planting. Some people just turn on their irrigation system directly after planting, if they have one, if they, for instance, filling a gap where a plant used to be. And that's simply not sufficient to remove the air pockets, to fill them with water. It's just not sufficient to use drip irrigation. So use a hose or a bucket, add the water gradually. Water is really heavy. It's something on the order of 44 pounds for a 5-gallon bucket. That will have the effect of really heavily compacting the soil that you've just added, which has been fairly light, and you just want to avoid compaction at all costs. It helps to settle the soil by adding water gradually, and then again, you just work upward. And when the soil no longer goes significantly below the top of the root ball, you're all set. So do we have any questions specifically related to planting techniques?
Let's see. We had a question about bare root fruit trees being planted in the winter, but you did answer that in the questions. We also had, kind of back to the first section, Pamela wanted to know, could you please explain the definition and give an example of a forb?
Forb is a flowering, non-woody plant that is not a grass.
So an example would be?
So, pardon me?
So an example would be?
Oh, example would be basically all the flowering plants we used to call perennials. But the thing about a perennial is a long living plant. Trees are perennials, shrubs are perennials, but a forb is, for instance, well, actually, some lavenders are considered woody perennials, but a penstemon or a sunflower or a Angelita daisy or and actually, technically, they're annuals as well. They're just flowering non-woody plants. So annuals of all sorts would be forbs. The thing is they flower, or fruit, because fruit is a result of flowering. Does that help out? Basically, I'm thinking of my garden, and I have chocolate flower and cone flowers and black-eyed Susans and daisies. Is that good?
Thank you. She got it.
Good.
Just as a point of reference for time, we're probably going to head a little bit over, so we appreciate everybody staying with us here.
And actually, the last section is pretty short, so we should be good. Are we good to go?
You're good to go.
Okay, so post-planting techniques. We're going to talk a little bit about watering, drip irrigation, mulching, and creating pathways and using them. With watering, our soil in general accepts water slowly. So hand watering, while it can be sort of a Zen thing, it's not very effective. You have to water slowly in order not to compact the soil, and you have to focus the water into where the roots are. So you need to use earthworks or berms in order to focus the water. Typically, people use drip irrigation for this very reason, so that number one, from a time perspective, you just turn the system on, whether it's just run off a hose bib or a timer, doesn't matter. Typically, you want to use your, they call it half-inch poly. It's not, it's 0.710 outside the diameter, but half-inch poly is okay. You want to move it through the plants. So there's a minimum of the 1/4 inch spaghetti line that is called, because this is where usually problems occur as the diameter gets smaller. I suggest, if you have drip irrigation, to use what are called pressure compensated type emitters rather than this, which is a shrubbler. The problem with shrubblers is if you adjust one shrubbler, it impacts all the other shrubblers on the line. So there's no way of knowing how much water. This, for instance, is a 2-gallon emitter. It will emit 2 gallons per hour as long as you don't overtax the system. The black ones of this particular variety are 1 gallon per hour. You don't know how many gallons are going here unless you take this and put it in a bucket and determine that. But again, if you need to adjust, then it's going to impact the entire line. Also, what I do in the first year, you connect this spaghetti line, and I put an emitter on each side of the plant. Water goes down by gravity and goes outward by capillary action. Typically, one can say it moves about 6 inches outward, in other words, laterally, horizontally. So in this way, each side of the root ball gets watered in the beginning. In this case, what I do is a new plant, but I'm going to water it half as long as I would have normally. You want to water enough. So this is a 1 gallon plant. Each time I want to water at least 1 full gallon. So in the beginning, I water for a half an hour because I have two emitters, 1 on each side. For a 5-gallon plant, I'd typically put 3 2-gallon emitters around the plant. Again, go for half as long a time, and I'm going to give it adequate water. With a tree, you just keep going up and up. So that's one way, that's an efficient way of watering for the first year. Irrigation systems are good for the year they're built. And let me quick do an analogy. If you're going to make a pizza and you're going to use a muffin, English muffin as the dough part, 1 tablespoon of sauce works beautifully for that. Okay, the next year the root system is going to be as big as maybe a boboli. 1 tablespoon of sauce is not going to do it. So you have to remember that you're watering the roots. You leave the ones near the root ball, never near the crown, but then you have to add out at what would be the drip line of most plants. In other words, the outer edges. So unless we have really good monsoons and predictable winter rain, you need to make sure that you're taking care of even natives. Without these monsoons in the last 2 years, natives also have been stressed. So think of that in terms of watering. And I can't tell you how frequently to water because it completely depends upon your soil, the aspect of your property, what direction is your garden facing. There's just too many questions to know. The best solution is a soil moisture meter, or for trees, and Jeff just wrote an article about this, you can use basically think of it as almost a smooth piece of metal that you can just push into the ground, and you should be able to go down for a 15-gallon tree, at least down a foot without great effort, because moist soil is giving soil and it's easy to push it downward. If it's dry, it's very difficult. Secondarily, you'll want to use mulch. You can either use organic mulch, and we did a scientific study when I was in the Master Gardener, well, it might not have been that class, but when I was affiliated with doing designs and such, organic mulch does not carry flame. It is safe to use near a home. The only organic concern was about piles of ponderosa pine, or pine needles rather, that are 12 inches or deeper. There we found that they would sort of nestle these embers and end up carrying fire. So organic mulch will help to improve the soil because of the breakdown of the organic matter. Pebbles, small pebbles or larger driveway type gravel is an effective mulch. Both of these help dissipate our hard rainfalls when they occur, which is good. It lessens the compaction of our soil, which is good. And larger organic mulches, this is just tree chippings, will also help to dissipate the water. The mulch serves to conserve moisture, to keep a more moderated temperature in the soil. There's not as many ups and downs, heating and cooling of the soil, and it helps to dampen weeds. With decomposed granite or small pebbles, it's a perfect medium for seed development, whether it's seeds you want or weed seeds, as are gravel situations. So sometimes people use landscape fabric underneath. Many people feel that landscape fabric, number one, is quite expensive. Number two, it sort of makes the roots gather up near the surface sometimes, because it creates a little bit of a moist area. And so instead of encouraging the roots to go down, and additionally, if you want to plant something new, you have the challenge of having to cut through it, find the irrigation line if you have irrigation, and dealing with that. So think about it, but use mulch. It helps in every regard. The only things like penstemon, which like a really lean soil, you want to lean toward the rock mulch, and they can take the heat additionally, as opposed to organic mulches. With pathways, build them and use them. Compaction is almost impossible to undo, and compaction of the soil prevents air and water from moving through the soil and feeding the root system. And basically, with your plants, you're always feeding the roots. The roots are what create everything else. So create pathways, whether you use something simple like decomposed granite. This is in my yard. I wind these through my garden so that I can maintain the plants all along. And if I do go venture inward, I frequently have steppers that I can step onto to avoid compacting. And you want to make certain not to ever really step on moist soil because it does compact readily once it's moist. You can use paver pathways, you can use gravel. I always try and, rather than having areas, if I know a pathway of mine that I have mulched and I know to use it, I do it. But if anyone else comes into my garden, I caution them to stay on decomposed granite or the obvious pathways, again, for that compaction thing. But whatever you do, build them and use them. Stepping stones, flagstones, doesn't matter, but it's critical to the health of your plants to have a nice soil that allows water and oxygen to permeate it. Basically, if you think of these three aspects, you should be well on your way to having a successful garden. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and any questions, comments?
Yes, we actually have several now.
Wonderful.
Marion wants to know, is there a good way to keep aphids off my milkweed in my butterfly garden?
You know, so this is my butterfly garden, and all of this in here, that's all horsetail milkweed. That's why this garden is a butterfly garden, because I discovered this pesky weed was actually a beneficial. And you know what? I just don't even worry about it. I found that they have, number one, milkweeds are designed to be eaten to the ground by caterpillars, and they just come back again. So if they're that resilient, I'm not even concerned about it. In fact, I found that it brings the ladybugs and other things which enjoy munching on the aphids. So I just think it's part of the food chain.
Great.
Or a stiff, take your hose and wash them off during the heat of the day.
Joanne asked, on planting and watering trees,
Mm-hmm.
I often see water directed at the trunk of the tree permanently and no other water to the drip zone. How does the tree deal with that?
By virtue of anything it gets during our rains.
Not well.
And if there's any other plants planted in proximity to the tree is absolutely stealing their water. So, certainly different plants have different drought tolerance. Many of our trees, because while it looks very dry everywhere, there is soil moisture because of precipitation principally. They have vast root systems, and so they're getting water somewhere, obviously.
Well, Marion asked a question about, she sees very overcrowded looking gardens with lots of different types of flowers. How does that work with plant spacing guides?
With plant
spacing guides. They say plant every so far.
Well, for instance, so there's a whole line of thinking, especially so with like vegetable gardens, is that essentially the foliage creates the shade, and so you want to plant tight in order, because we have such harsh sun. You plant close in order to shade the soil. You don't want to see a bit of soil. That's one line of thought. In this case, for instance, if you're looking at my garden, horsetail milkweed runs. I can't stop it. The only reason it's not in the middle of my pathways is I did put landscape fabric under my decomposed granite. And so in this case, there's, again, they all interact in a way. Now these are 80% native plants in this garden, and they all work it out. So spacing is, what do you want your garden to look like? I have a pretty, how do I want to say, neat and tidy garden up top, because it's what I look at directly from my deck. But down here, this is for butterflies and pollinators. So I'm giving them as much food as they can, and I let everything interact. And for instance, the milkweed grows directly up through the rubber rabbit brush, directly through the grasses. This is actually a yucca that is being overtaken by a native plant. If I see anything the growth being stunted in any way, then I will address it by taking it out. Or if, like in the case of this particular wildflower, when it starts to brown, it's an annual, I just rip it out, and that way I know that the yucca is giving its full share. But also this is a south-facing full sun garden. Nobody minds a little bit of shade in this regard. Now, with trees planted too close together, and indeed, my parents planted, these are all Arizona cypress, they're planted 10 foot on center. Well, they're each about 30 feet high and 20 feet wide. And so they're definitely shaded one another, but it was something created a long time ago, and there's no undoing it. Were I to now take out every other tree, there would be large gaps in where limbs are. So in this instance, because it's a screen, I leave them. But in another instance, if there's a small tree that is shading something else and I think this something else is more important, then I'll address the tree, or vice versa.
Okay, great. Our last question is from Carolyn, and she wants to know, what is the correct depth for the mulch cover? 1 to 3 inches?
I'd go 2 to 4. Now, the only thing about mulch is it helps to insulate the soil, which means your springtime soil will also warm up more slowly. So sometimes if I know I'm going to be planting in the spring, I'll go ahead and remove the mulch from specific areas that I'm going to be working. Sometimes I even will put the wall of water there simply to warm the soil, and then I'll move it and then go ahead and plant. But it does, it's an insulation, and so the more the better to hold in the moisture. But you must have a way for the water to get in. So make sure. So for instance, I use wood chippings a lot. They're free, and they're a larger diameter, and water tends to move through them well. I know people, I amended this garden originally because it was originally a vegetable garden until the gophers took over. But I amended it profusely with Wilby's. Now, Wilby's compost, I enjoyed it for the nitrogen, but it is a very small gauge sort of mulch, and a lot of times water had a hard time percolating through it. And that's the case if you use compost on the surface. Additionally, same thing. Water doesn't like to move between soil-like surfaces. So just make sure that water can get through. So if you have irrigation, if it's a pressure-controlled emitter, it can be under the mulch. In fact, you want to mulch over irrigation lines because they are the UV and the sun will disintegrate them through time. So if you have an irrigation system underneath the mulch, then you know water's getting under the mulch. If you don't have irrigation system, then you might consider having more dramatic berms that are not mulched as heavily. Mulch heavily in between and not so much right at the drip line.
This kind of tags right into it, so I'm going to feed you this one last one, then we'll have to cut it off. Cynthia says, Jeff advises not to mulch fruit trees. What do you think? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Well, one of the things that I've found useful is you always, with fruit trees, you do add organic material to the soil in order to have nice friable soil. But what I've also found that I've done is I've used compost on the surface, not near the trunk, but on the surface, and every time there's precipitation, there's some degree of leaching down, and there's sort of this continual soil improvement, which I've found has made my soil, because it's particularly heavy, lighter and lighter, and the trees more productive. I don't know his reason for not. Well, I know that, with the stone fruit and stuff, they want the hours of freezing I wasn't aware that that was relative to the roots. By all means, I will defer to Jeff's expertise, and I still believe that moderating that, because when soil freezes, if we have a hard winter, then no water, no water can get through, which means no air either. So to me, it seems logical, and I know he must have a scientific reason for this, to moderate the temperatures somewhat. And if nothing more than, you don't want the weed growth, and you're going to, well, you are going, okay, backtrack. It's because of the need for fertilizer, because all fruit trees need a significant amount of nitrogen. In order to get the nitrogen, you have to literally put pounds of fertilizer down. You want the fertilizer to have contact with the earth. So I bet you that's exactly why. And he's not on tonight, is he? That's probably why. But I would just move the mulch back, fertilize, and return it. But you want to work the fertilizer partly into the soil to prevent that phosphorus fixing that Jeff referred to in his article because of the calcium in our soils.
Excellent. Well, this has been wonderful. Leslie, thank you so, so much. I want to thank everyone who's still with us tonight. Before we finish, I'd like to invite you all to join us for our next talk. It's going to be, I believe, I didn't put the date here, I think it's September 25th. It's going to be outstanding. Rebecca Serratos, Master Gardener and Program Coordinator with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension right here in Yavapai County, will be speaking on seed saving. Perfect topic for a perfect time. She will be covering the following: brief history of seed saving, why save seeds, seed saving techniques, addressing cross-pollination, and she'll be sharing a list of local and Southwest resources. So look to our website. I've posted it a couple times in the chat box. Somebody just said, is Friday, this is the 25th of Friday? I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date. You'll receive notice just the way you found this one. We're going to publicize it all over. It will be on our website, which I did put in the chat box. So thanks everyone, and have a great planting time.